Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by ED Care. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861.
Anita Johnston, PhD, CEDS, is a licensed clinical psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist and supervisor who's worked in the field of women's issues and eating disorders for over 35 years. She is the author of the best-selling book Eating in the Light of the Moon and co-creator of the Light of the Moon Café, a series of online interactive courses and women's support circles and soul hunger workshops. She is currently the clinical director of Pono, Hawaii eating disorder programs, with outpatient programs in Oahu and the Big Island of Hawaii and oceanfront residential programs in Maui. If you want to connect with Dr. Johnston, please go to dranitajohnston.com. Anita, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Oh, one of my favorite people, one of my favorite eating disorder treatment professionals. It's the best. I'm so excited to talk with you today. We're talking about diet culture, how to let go of it, and really using your perspective, having not grown up in diet culture and kind of connecting to some things like our wisdom and other forms of information about how we should be treating our bodies instead of just having diet culture inform everything we do. So to get started, will you tell us a little bit about your growing up story and how diet culture wasn't a part of it?
Yeah, well, I didn't realize, it's sort of like a fish in water, right? I didn't realize that I had grown up that way until someone had asked me, because I've been working in the field of eating disorders for, 35 years. And someone asked me, well, did you ever have an eating disorder? And I didn't. And I'm not sure. At that time, I thought, well, why didn't I? Because I definitely have the personality, right? I'm emotionally sensitive. I'm really intuitive. I can be very perfectionistic. I mean, it's like I got a lot of those qualities. And when I took a look at it, I thought, well, maybe it's because I didn't grow up in dieting culture. And then I thought to myself, maybe I'm making that up, right? It's like, when you try to remember back, maybe I missed something. So not too long ago, I was with my girlfriend who we've been best friends since we were 13. And as adults, we happened to live next to each other. And so we raised our daughters together. And I still see her every chance that I can get when I go to Hawaii. And so we were sitting around and I said, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. Do you remember, were our moms ever on diets? She went, my mom never was. And I went, yeah, neither was my mom. Do you remember other people being on diets? And the more we talked about it, I realized, no, that wasn't a part of the culture that I grew up in. Now, that's not to say there maybe there were people on diets, but it wasn't something that was talked about. I don't remember the discussions of that. So that's when I started to realize, oh, how fortunate for me, and that's probably what saved me from that. And I was right on the cusp, I think, because I have a sister she's like 8 years younger than I, and she ended up with an eating disorder because that was right about the time that things were shifting. But when I was a girl, which was in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't, and on Guam, which is a little behind the times, thank goodness, for me, there wasn't a lot of that. And first of all, there wasn't a lot of imagery that was delivered up. Very, very, very different. So from the way it is today. So I think imagery is a way that diet culture can really take hold. And what I mean by that is, back then, when I was living on Guam and growing up, there was one TV station, if you can imagine, and it was black and white. So we never watched it. It was kind of like ridiculous. It wasn't anything. There might have been shows here and there, but we didn't spend much time watching TV. And there weren't a lot of magazines then. There was 17, and there was Ladies' Home Journal, I think McCall's, but even then there was a lot more in terms of articles than images. And then there was this magazine called True Confessions. For those of your older listeners, you may recall this. And there weren't photos. There were sketches or hand-drawn images. It was all there was. And then there were all these like sordid tales that were told in the story, in the magazine. So I wasn't exposed to a whole lot of imagery that was touting how someone is supposed to look. And there weren't a lot of ads about going on this diet or that diet. And even, the movie theater, there was like it would be a new movie maybe every week. So there was all of that going on. It was different in terms of this kind of like homogenized idea. I also grew up, so it was a multi-ethnic culture. There were people of so many different ethnicities and so many different languages and so many different looks. So there was the dominant American culture that was coming in, but there was still so many other things going on. So diet culture hadn't taken hold yet.
How did you become aware of diet culture? When did you start to notice it, and when was it part of your world, even though you hadn't internalized all the negative crap that it gives you?
Wow, I'm not sure. I don't think when I was in college, I don't remember diet talk. Now, this is the early 1970s. Twiggy had come on the scene, so that had made a bit of a shift in terms of what was considered the beauty ideal. But I don't recall, and maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I don't recall. Certainly among my friends, we didn't talk about, I got to go on a diet.
Right.
Other than it might have been said in jest, but not even hardly that. Yeah, again, I may have a faulty memory, but I'm forcing myself now to try to think about this. It wasn't until I, pretty much maybe by the time I was in graduate school, and of course then I started working with eating disorders, and so that's why I was so fascinated when I first started working with eating disorders, because it this focus and emphasis and suffering around the size and shape of the body. It was fascinating to me because I needed to understand this, and I didn't have a whole lot of lived experience. Now, also, mind you, my body type was naturally thin. So there were times that I did try to gain weight because I felt kind of scrawny. And again, this is back, the body ideal in the 50s and 60s was not skinny. And I really did struggle with my body because I didn't have any curves and I didn't have breasts. And so I felt a little out of it in that regard. So maybe that's not really diet culture, but the body image stuff started to come in and affect me as a teenager.
Sure. I just think your perspective is so helpful and probably really interesting to people listening, because I bet that I would imagine people maybe slightly older than I am, but definitely my age and younger can't imagine what it's like to grow up, at least in a country like America, without diet culture. Like, that makes zero sense to me, unfortunately.
No, I mean, my daughters are your age and they grew up in diet culture for sure.
Mm-hmm. What ways do you think diet culture is harmful to people?
Well, it depends on what you mean by culture. I think culture can be very helpful in terms of, it seems like its function is to give us a sense of belonging, of being connected to something bigger than ourselves. And there are rituals involved in cultures that can be very rich and can really deepen that sense of belonging. But here's where things get a little awry in my mind. And this is where, again, diet culture can take hold. Is because while with culture we can get a sense of belonging, what gets distorted is that this idea of fitting in. And they're not the same thing. So belonging is when you feel connected to others and to something bigger as you stay connected to your true self, the uniqueness of your being. Fitting in is when you feel like you have to look like and think like and act like and feel like how others think you ought to think and look and act and feel. And what happens with when you shift this idea of belonging to fitting in, and you end up abandoning your true self or your sense of who you are and what your true destiny is on this planet, there's so much pain involved with that. And it's not unusual for people to grab onto whatever they can to cope with the pain, whether that be eating or even negative body image thoughts or substances or whatever.
Yeah, I like your point there about differentiating between fitting in and belonging. And I just am thinking about how one of the things that I find to be really harmful about diet culture and just the way that diets are so pervasive in our culture is that I think because of that, in part, people can use dieting and dieting behaviors to earn esteem because they are praised and certain weights are praised. And I just feel like that's so toxic to people when really everybody's going to exist where their body wants to exist, and certainly not all bodies look the same.
It's toxic because it's not true esteem.
Right.
So true esteem doesn't come from someone saying, oh, you're so beautiful, or you're so fit, or you're so thin, or you're so talented, or whatever. True self-esteem comes from a sense of mastery. So that's when when there's something we go, oh, I really want to do that, but I don't know if I can, or I don't think. Well, I'm going to try, but I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. I'm getting it. Oh, I got it. That's what esteem comes from. It's an inside job. What the dieting culture is it's conditioned belief systems. And I'm sorry, but that is not where true self-esteem comes from. True self-esteem comes from finding who you are and finding ways to express that and develop that and cultivate that. So all of us are up against, the double-edged sword of culture, which really does try to condition us. Are these forces to try to get us to fit in? And that makes us very vulnerable to diet culture. Is when you're trying to get your esteem and your sense of belonging from fitting in. You're in trouble. That's a rough go because you can never get it. That's when you get into the never enough thing. Never good enough, never thin enough, never fit enough, never whatever enough.
Right. And I am really sympathetic toward people who are struggling, especially difficultly with diet culture and trying not to diet and internalize messages from diet culture when reducing their body size feels like something that's going to be socially beneficial or is socially beneficial because maybe your doctor is not going to make fat shaming comments. Maybe your body doesn't feel like it is congruent with the gender that you identify as, and making your body smaller feels like it will improve all of those things or does in some way. And I just feel like diet culture just really corrupts so much, unfortunately.
Well, it does. And it's really hard to deal with because we're not just talking about how diet culture affects your mind. or your psyche, but also it affects your brain, we're discovering now. So with neuroscience, we understand that when we're little, it's not just our minds that are developing, but our brains. And so we know that our frontal lobes, right? That's the part of our brain that's cause and effect and abstract concepts. And that doesn't fully come on board until we're in our mid-20s. And so what that means is when we're little, when we're younger, we don't have all the faculties we have available to us as adults. Because of that, our thought processes are different than what we have as an adult. And it works something like this. And this is the case for all of us. The way our minds work because of the structure of our brain when we're little goes something like this. Bad things happen. I feel bad. I must be bad. Mommy and daddy got a divorce. It feels bad. It must be my fault. And then when we get older and we get our frontal lobes and we have the brain of an adult and the mind of an adult, we can revisit those stories and go, oh yeah, there's 1,001 reasons why mom and dad got a divorce and none of them have anything to do with me. So now let's imagine what's happening to children and our brains when they're just developing. It goes, and in a culture and sometimes even families that are so fat phobic that the message over and over is fat is bad. So it's like low fat, non-fat, all fat is like, that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It's dangerous. It's bad. So then what happens to the developing child brain and the mind is that bad things happen. I feel bad fat. I am bad fat. Because bad and fat get linked. With neuroscience, we know the neurons that wire together, fire together. Excuse me, the other way around. Fire together, wire together. So that this idea of bad and fat get linked. So you're not just dealing with a culture or your psyche where you've internalized that, but you've got some neural pathways in your brain already that are making those connections that aren't true. So these can be the best stories a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, even a 15-year-old could come up with, but it doesn't mean they're true.
Yes. And I love that point too, because I think it offers a lot of perspective for people when they're working through rejecting diet culture or maybe working on eating disorder recovery, when they're trying to get rid of those messages that they've been so steeped in, and why those are so deeply entrenched is in part because there's this neuropsych component going on too. That's why it takes a while for, even if you know something, I would say intellectually to be true, it takes longer for you to know it emotionally to be true. There's a lag time. And part of that is what's going on in your brain.
Yeah. And the good news is, though, we can change our brains. And we know now that we create new neural pathways till the day we die. So every single time that you become aware of a message from diet culture and you investigate it, you're making a superhighway of a neural pathway towards understanding that. And eventually, that old pathway that believed in the messages from diet culture, that gets overgrown because you don't go down it over and over again. So to me, it helps to understand why it's so frustrating to shift your belief systems. But also, it gives hope that, yeah, you can do this, you can change that, but it requires repetition.
Yes.
And it's not to beat yourself up whenever you notice yourself, because we all get caught up in it. We're fish in this water. But every single time you go, oh, that's a manipulation, or oh, that's not true, then you're creating new neural pathways in your brain, and it will make it easier eventually.
I love that point. It's just so well said. And I'm sure you could offer your own examples of how that's happened for you. But in my story, I grew up in a home that I was extremely fat phobic, and there are multiple influences in my life, multiple people who had been in my life who definitely perpetuated those messages. And in recovery, I remember having so much internalized fat phobia around. That was my biggest fear because I had a restrictive eating disorder and I was a thinner person at that time and still am on the thinner side of the spectrum, and just was so fearful of becoming fat because that had been drilled into me. Fat equals bad, fat equals bad, fat equals bad. And through my own recovery and then obviously working with as a clinician, that is genuinely not at all what I feel in my heart at all. And now emotionally, it feels true that all bodies are good. And that was through a ridiculous amount of practice and therapy.
Yeah, but here's the thing. With that practice, every single time you're shifting that thought, you are changing your brain. And so, eventually you can get to a place where you are able to experience and see things differently. But if you figure, how many messages that you got growing up, it's important to be kind to yourself as you're changing that and say, oh, no wonder I'm having this thought. But just because it's been a repetitive thought doesn't mean it's true.
Mm-hmm. Yes, things really do change with practice. I love that point that you brought home so eloquently. I wanted to also talk with you about diet culture and how it affects people at different ages, from children and teens. And then I also wanted to make sure we talk about young adults and midlife and beyond midlife, because I think it's toxic to us all. And I wanted to make sure that we point out certain age groups so that there's a different perspective for each.
Well, yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, children and teenagers are especially vulnerable because their brains are they're not fully developed. So that means their brains can be shaped in ways in which they buy into diet culture more easily. So I think there are those vulnerabilities. And then you tie in the whole identity issue, which has to do more with the mind than the brain, the psyche. And you're trying to identify who you are. And so that makes you particularly vulnerable to messages in the media or in the culture that are trying to tell you who you should be and how you should look and how you should eat and what you shouldn't look like and blah, 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 blah. So there is a great vulnerability, I think, as children and as adolescents because of that. And the folks that are in the business of helping us feel bad about the way we look so they can sell us products and make money, they know this, right? They know this.
Yep.
And so I think it helps to recognize that that's when you're most vulnerable and you will be manipulated until you cultivate this consciousness. Then I think it does hit. We now know that, for example, with eating disorders, the two most vulnerable windows are puberty and perimenopause. And that's because those are the times for women that our bodies are morphing. And so whenever your body is morphing and then you have this cultural ideal of what it's supposed to look like and it doesn't fit that, then you're also super vulnerable to these messages that, oh my God, you should go on a diet, you should lose weight and all that nonsense. Because you start going, wait, what's happening to my body? And you feel a little out of control. And one of the things that a diet offers you is it offers you the spell that you can be in control of everything. And so when you're feeling like, oh, I really need some control, you are susceptible to that and can buy into that, I think, more easily. So I think there are different times in our lives that we can be more easily influenced by the massive amount of money that is supporting diet culture.
Yes, definitely. And it's so interesting and unfortunate that perimenopause is one of those times too, and that I feel like this probably happens in your practice too, but that initial idea that people who are struggling with disordered eating or eating disorders are all young white women is so not true. And I think some of the diversity that we're seeing in our practice is that people who are not in their early 20s and teens are coming in, people who are midlife or later are coming in too, because diet culture continues to have such a strong effect on people. Just really anytime your body is changing, or if you are in a body that's marginalized in general.
Well, yeah, it has an effect on anyone, but we don't know about that because I don't know if you're familiar with the WEIRD study.
No, tell me.
Some Canadian researchers, they basically kind of cracked open the ethnocentric aspects of our research and also in psychology. And Western, industrialized, educated, democratic cultures, okay? I think I got all those letters in there. Most of the research like the lion's share of the research in the behavioral sciences have been done on people from those cultures. And not only that, but most of those studies were done on college students. So we're making all kinds of assumptions about all kinds of things that people struggle with based on this research that is so tilted. And it really is, the people that have been studied are on the edges of the bell curve. So when I looked at that, I thought, well, no wonder we can see where we got that idea about why people with eating disorders are thin white women is because that's who was studied.
Right.
So those of us that are on the front lines, of course we know differently. And after 30 years of private practice in Hawaii, it was like, well, yeah, of course. And it was obvious to me that that wasn't the case. But that does get perpetuated continually, still to this day. But the research behind it is totally flawed.
Yes, deeply. And that's actually the problem overall with psych research, is that the populations who are studied are extremely limited and not representative, which calls into question the validity of the whole deal.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important that those of us on the front line speak up about what we're seeing, because that's our experience and people need to know about it.
Absolutely. So with your work with clients, how do you teach them how to reject diet culture, and why is that important for recovery?
Well, boy, the way I do it is through storytelling, of course. And because this idea that you can't let go of those thoughts, but if you investigate the thoughts, they will let go of you. So it's sort of like if you say, okay, I don't want to think that, you can get stuck in that. But if you can just get very curious, and for me, that's where curiosity is really the key. I'll say to someone, did you how long have you hated your thighs? Oh, I've always hated my thighs. Really? When you were a little baby rolling around on your back and playing with your toes, did you hate your thighs then? Oh, well, probably not. And so start to track. It's like, okay, so let's see. When did you get this idea that there was something wrong with your thighs? Because it sounds like you weren't born with that idea. And just to start really investigate where that came from. Because we have so many thoughts. Frankly, I think most of our thoughts, they're not our own thoughts. It's ways of thinking that we've been conditioned to think. And so that's one way to unravel it, is through that curiosity. And then I use stories that will have someone develop a different way of looking at that which they think is the truth, simply because they've thought it over and over and over again, and because they've been told it over and over and over again.
Right. And we can loop back to one of your original points, was that you can cultivate different thoughts that become your normal thoughts and let go of these other thoughts that you've been conditioned to think. I know that it's so hard when everything still feels really true and you're stuck with all these messages you've rehearsed for a long time, but you can practice these different things. And I love that you approach that by using curiosity and storytelling so that you can have that opportunity to choose different things.
Yeah, you kind of have to break the spell. We're all under a spell, and we're bombarded by these messages all the time to reinforce the spell. And so really what breaks the spell is curiosity. That's what the stories tell us.
I love it. Tell us about some ways that people can start to dismantle diet culture. So not just working on it within yourself, but maybe a little bit outside of yourself as well.
Well, I think for each of us, we have to decide where's our place in that. And so there are people that are introverts and there are people that are extroverts. And so those that are extroverts, they may be more comfortable in an advocacy role. But those that are introverts, they may be more comfortable really just being true to themselves. So, for example, that would mean saying something to someone if they said a joke that was demeaning towards someone of a bigger size, and to, just in the context of that one relationship, saying, I don't find that funny. I think that's mean. Or to say, I don't think that's true. So I think we get to choose how we're going to do this, but I think it's a matter of really working really hard to shift our perceptions and to recognize the way in which you've been conditioned and manipulated to think and view things differently. I think exposing yourself to different images so that you're not relying on the media to give you images of what is beautiful or what is valued. So I think there's a lot of different paths a person can go down, but I think they're important paths, all of them.
Right. And I love your point too, because I think advocacy is really important in recovery. And I think that there are a ton of different ways that people can do that. And so for you, if it's even something like internally reminding yourself, oh, I don't participate in diet talk when you're at a dinner with a bunch of friends who are doing that, that counts. All the way over to if you are called to do so and you become an activist and you have a public platform and you are out there raising awareness and talking about the really important talking points that need to be aired. All of that, I think, counts and is so helpful in having just an alternative to diet culture that we're just steeped in nonstop.
And there's also this idea, I made it up. I call it omniteracy. And I remember getting this idea first when my daughters were young and the internet was new. And I remember my daughter was doing some research and it popped up porn site, and I went, oh my gosh. And she goes, oh, Mom, look. And she said, this is how you block this stuff. And I remember thinking, oh, I didn't have to grow up with that skill, but it's a very important skill to have now. And I call it omniteracy, which is the ability to omit from your life that which doesn't serve you. So I think, what you're talking about when you say, oh, yeah, I don't participate in diet talk. You omit that from your life. And I think it's an important skill. And I think that is a way to help. If we're all doing it, we're chipping away at diet culture.
Omniteracy. I love it. I will be using that with all of my clients. Don't worry, I'll cite my source. So in wrapping up today, tell us what you've been up to with Light of the Moon Café and what you've been focusing on with that. And I, of course, will link to your website in the show notes as per usual, but tell us a little bit about what you've been working on with that.
Well, let's see. I did a summit where I interviewed a bunch of wonderful folks, including you.
Yes, thank you.
And there was a lot of talk in that summit around diet culture. And that's, for me, I'm an extrovert. So that's one way to just get the word out there. It was a free summit. Anyone could have listened to it. And then I did a webinar just the other night. And then because I'm launching the new class, the Light of the Moon Café, the New Crescent Moon course, which is an 8-week online course for women around the world that are struggling with eating difficulties of any type. And it's also it's a virtual place that is to give people respite from diet culture. It's a space people can go where there isn't that kind of talk. And not only that, but there's just deeper understanding about what the struggle is really about, which you wouldn't get access to if you were focused on being on a diet. So that's my joy. If anyone wants to learn more about it, they can go to lightofthemooncafe.com and get caught up on what's the latest. And it is a platform where I can do my little piece to address what I call the nonsense. And it's nonsense that's out there everywhere. It's really fun. We have a forum. So in the online courses, I have self-study courses that people can go and just do by themselves if that's their style. But if they want something interactive, it's basically like an interactive workbook for eating in the light of the moon. And I'm on the forum every day and responding to comments and to questions. So what I'd like to say is that there are pockets now that are developing of places to get respite from diet culture.
Yes, I was actually just thinking that very same point, that it's so important that I think any of the eating disorder expert leaders in the field would recommend to you, for sure, find your tribe, find your people who don't want to participate in diet culture. And there are lots and lots of people who are omitting that and opting out and do not want a part of it. And it's wonderful that your community is another pocket of that, like you said, and that there's so much good information there too about how you can question diet culture and improve your relationship with food and body from this place of curiosity and the wisdom of storytelling too.
Yeah, and there's the health at every size communities. People also talk about Facebook and give it a bad rap in terms of how it promotes diet culture. But what I also know about Facebook is there are all kinds of groups on Facebook that omit diet culture and post really positive, diverse images that also can combat what's going on in mass culture. So I think you can use it wisely.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And there's research out there that supports that if you consume body positive media, your own body image will improve. So that's part of it too, is having images in your feeds that are actually representative of what people in the world look like.
Right. And omitting those that promote diet mentality.
Love it. Love it. Well, Anita, any words of wisdom to wrap up that you want to offer to our listeners after this?
Well, I think I want to remind people that even if it feels like an impossible task, even if it feels like a David and Goliath kind of battle, it can be won with consciousness, and that's the key.
Mm-hmm. And lots of practice and compassion while you learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anita, thank you so much for taking the time to be here again. I will link to all of your websites, including Light of the Moon Café, in case anybody is interested in that. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure, Janine.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.